It was just another busy morning at the little cafe in downtown Los Angeles. The sun had barely risen, but the cafe was already bustling with people, eager to grab their coffee before heading to work. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and the sound of the espresso machine whizzing and steaming echoed through the room. It was a typical scene for Mark, the owner of the cafe, who prided himself on serving good coffee to his loyal customers. Mark was no stranger to stress. Running a cafe in such a busy neighborhood was a challenge every day. He had opened this place 5 years ago, hoping to create a space where people could relax, chat, and enjoy their drinks. But as time went on, the pressure grew. The cafe's popularity had soared, and with it, the stress of keeping everything in order. Mark often found himself working long hours, trying to keep up with orders and make sure everything ran smoothly. This morning, the cafe was especially crowded. A group of college students had claimed the long table by the window, loudly discussing their assignments while sipping on caramel lattes. A businessman was hunched over his laptop, trying to finish a report before his meeting. A mother with a stroller was at the counter, trying to decide between a muffin and a croissant. The line was getting longer, and the chatter of voices filled the space. Mark couldn't help but feel overwhelmed. As he moved behind the counter, his gaze flicked toward the door. A new customer had walked in, a woman, maybe in her late 70s. She was slow, walking with the help of a cane. She wore a soft purple scarf, her silver hair neatly tied back, and her face showed the signs of age. But there was kindness in her eyes. Mark didn't recognize her, but the sight of her moving so slowly made him impatient. The cafe was getting busier by the minute, and he needed to keep things moving. The woman took a moment to glance at the menu, holding her cane in one hand and looking a bit confused. Mark felt the familiar annoyance rising in him. He couldn't afford to waste time on people who took too long to decide. "Come on, lady," he muttered under his breath, barely audible to the other customers. But as she finally spoke up, her voice was soft, almost hesitant. "I'll have a small black coffee, please," she said, fumbling for her wallet. Mark's eyes narrowed. He wasn't in the mood to wait around while someone struggled to pay. The line behind her was starting to grow, and the last thing he wanted was to be slowed down. He couldn't help but snap, "You're holding up the line. Do you have the money or not?" His voice was sharper than he intended, and a few heads turned to look. The elderly woman, startled, apologized quietly, and her hand shook as she searched her purse. Mark's patience was wearing thin. He glanced at the people in line behind her, feeling the weight of their impatience. Finally, the woman found the exact change and handed it to him. He grabbed it quickly, his frustration building as he handed her the cup of coffee. "Thanks," she said softly, trying to move toward an empty table, but her hand slipped slightly, causing the cup to wobble. The sight made Mark even more annoyed. He muttered under his breath and turned back to his other customers. But something about the scene made him feel uneasy, though he didn't want to admit it. At that moment, the woman took a seat by the window, quietly sipping her coffee, her eyes looking out at the busy street. She seemed calm, unaffected by the tense interaction. Mark, on the other hand, was still fuming, trying to focus on his work and keep the cafe running smoothly. Little did he know, the quiet, unnoticed woman would soon become the center of something much bigger. The cafe continued to buzz with the noise of morning conversations, the soft clink of spoons against cups, and the steady hum of the coffee machines. Mark tried his best to focus on his tasks, but his mind kept drifting back to the elderly woman. Something about her had rubbed him the wrong way, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. It wasn't just the way she hesitated at the counter. It was the way she had looked at him, almost as if she wasn't fazed by his rudeness. He didn't like it. Meanwhile, Mrs. Johnson, the elderly woman, settled into her chair by the window. She had picked a quiet corner, far from the noise of the rest of the cafe. She seemed at peace, gazing out at the busy street, watching people rushed by on their way to work. The world outside was moving fast, but she took her time, savoring the stillness in her own little corner of the cafe. She took small, slow sips of her coffee, the warmth of the cup in her hands a comfort to her. Mrs. Johnson had lived in the city for many years, and she knew how busy life could get. She had seen the world change in ways that sometimes felt overwhelming. But for her, the simple pleasures were the ones that mattered most: the quiet mornings, the peaceful moments, and the taste of a good cup of coffee. She had learned to appreciate these things as she grew older, to find joy in small moments, and not to let the fast-paced world around her shake her inner peace. She didn't let the tension from the counter bother her. She had lived through much harder times in her life, and a little rudeness didn't faze her. What mattered was that she was here, in this place, enjoying her coffee. She could see the people around her, some of them hurried, some of them lost in their phones, but all of them too busy to notice the beauty of the moment. But there was something else she noticed. The man who had been standing behind the counter earlier, the one who had been impatient with her, he seemed to be acting differently now. She watched him move from one customer to the next, his face tense, his movements quick and sharp. It was as though he was trying to make up for the awkwardness of their interaction, but it only seemed to make him more frustrated. Mrs. Johnson sighed quietly and took another sip of her coffee. Across the room, the line at the counter was growing longer, as it always did during the morning rush. People were getting impatient, glancing at their watches, tapping their feet. Mark, now visibly irritated, was trying his best to keep up with the orders. His hands were moving faster than his thoughts, and his frustration was growing with every new customer. He shot a quick glance at Mrs. Johnson, still sitting by the window, seemingly unaffected by the chaos around her. He couldn't understand how someone could be so calm in a place like this, where everything was moving so fast. To him, her calmness seemed almost strange. It was like she didn't even care about the rush, about the pressure, about the busy world that everyone else was caught up in. It made him feel even more on edge. What Mark didn't know, however, was that Mrs. Johnson wasn't just any elderly woman. She had lived through many struggles in her life, and had seen enough of the world to know that there was something deeper to people than what met the eye. She wasn't someone who could be easily rattled. And though Mark might have felt like he was in control of his cafe, he was about to learn that sometimes life had a way of surprising you when you least expected it. As Mrs. Johnson quietly enjoyed her coffee, unaware of the growing tension around her, Mark's frustration continued to build. The cafe was getting busier by the minute, and he was struggling to keep up with the flood of customers. His movements became more rushed, more frantic, and every little delay felt like a personal setback. The line at the counter seemed to stretch on forever, and his patience was starting to wear thin. Then, as though the universe had decided to test him further, Mrs. Johnson's coffee cup suddenly tilted, spilling a little bit of coffee onto the table. It wasn't much, just a small puddle, but to Mark, it felt like the last straw. His jaw tightened as he walked over to her table, already irritated by the sight of the small spill. "Hey, you need to be more careful with your coffee," he said sharply, startling Mrs. Johnson. She looked up at him with wide eyes, clearly taken aback by his tone. "I'm so sorry," she said softly, her voice trembling just a little. She reached for a napkin to clean up the mess, but Mark wasn't finished. He was so caught up in his frustration that he didn't even notice how upset she seemed. "Honestly, you should be more aware of your surroundings," he continued, his voice louder now, drawing the attention of a few nearby customers. Mrs. Johnson's hands shook slightly as she tried to clean up the small spill, but Mark wasn't finished. "Look, if you can't handle a simple cup of coffee without making a mess, maybe you shouldn't be here in the first place," Mark added, his words cutting through the calm atmosphere like a sharp knife. The cafe was silent for a moment, the other customers exchanging awkward glances, unsure of how to react. Mrs. Johnson sat there, stunned, not knowing what to say. She hadn't expected such harshness, especially over something as small as a spilled drink. She had lived a long life, and while she had seen her fair share of rude people, she hadn't expected it here, in this quiet cafe, where she had hoped to find a little peace. "I'm really sorry," she repeated quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. But Mark was already turning away, his attention back on the growing line of customers. The moment had passed, but it left an uncomfortable tension in the air. Mrs. Johnson felt her heart sink as she slowly gathered her belongings, ready to leave. She didn't want to make a scene, and she certainly didn't want to cause any more trouble. She had always believed in treating others with kindness, no matter the circumstances. But she couldn't help but feel a little hurt by the way Mark had treated her. As she stood up to leave, she moved slowly toward the door, her cane tapping softly against the floor. She wasn't sure if anyone had noticed how she'd been treated, but she didn't want to dwell on it. She had learned a long time ago that not every encounter in life was going to be kind. What mattered most was how she chose to respond. But just as she reached the door, a voice stopped her in her tracks. "Excuse me, ma'am." She turned to find a man standing by the counter, looking at her with a gentle expression. It was hard to tell at first, but he seemed vaguely familiar. "I'm really sorry about what happened," he said, his tone kind and sincere. "Please, take a seat again. I'll make sure you get another cup of coffee on me." Mrs. Johnson hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say, but the kindness in the stranger's voice made her pause. She nodded slowly and returned to her seat by the window, grateful for the unexpected offer. As Mrs. Johnson sat back down, taking a deep breath to calm herself, she looked around the cafe once again. The quiet corner by the window had become her little escape, a moment of peace in an otherwise busy world. She took a small sip from her coffee, still warm, and for a brief second, the tension seemed to fade. The man who had spoken to her, the one behind the counter, had left, but she was thankful for the brief kindness he had shown her. What she didn't know was that the situation she had just experienced had caught the attention of someone else entirely. Johnny Depp, a well-known actor, had been sitting in a corner of the cafe, far enough to avoid the usual spotlight. He had entered just a few minutes before Mrs. Johnson, seeking a quiet place to enjoy a coffee and maybe work on some writing. The last thing he expected was to witness what he had just seen. He had been sitting with his head down, reading through some notes for a new project, when the interaction between Mark and Mrs. Johnson caught his attention. At first, Johnny thought it was just another normal cafe moment, nothing out of the ordinary. But as Mark's tone grew sharper and Mrs. Johnson's face became more flushed, Johnny couldn't help but look up from his notes. It wasn't just the rudeness that caught his attention. It was the way it made the atmosphere in the cafe shift, leaving everyone in an awkward silence. Johnny's expression hardened as he watched Mark continue to speak to the elderly woman, his words growing colder with each sentence. It wasn't the first time Johnny had seen someone be treated poorly, but it still unsettled him every time. He could feel the discomfort around him from the other customers. It was as if no one was brave enough to stand up, and Johnny understood that kind of fear. He had been in situations like that himself, times when it was easy to stay quiet and let things unfold. But something about this moment was different. Johnny watched as Mrs. Johnson, clearly embarrassed, tried to clean up the mess from her spilled coffee. The way she apologized so quietly made him feel for her even more. She wasn't looking for attention or to make trouble. She just wanted to enjoy her coffee in peace, and yet she had been treated with such impatience. Without thinking much longer, Johnny stood up and made his way toward the counter, his footsteps purposeful and steady. He wasn't the type of person to let something like this slide, not when he could see how deeply it affected someone. He wasn't sure exactly what he was going to say, but he knew that Mrs. Johnson deserved something more than what she had received. He walked past the tables of people who had been watching, some of them glancing nervously between him and Mark. Johnny reached the counter, his eyes meeting Mark's for a brief moment. The cafe owner didn't seem to recognize Johnny at first, his attention still on the crowd in front of him, trying to manage orders. Johnny took a deep breath, and then, calmly, he spoke up, his voice clear and steady. "Excuse me, sir, but I think you owe that lady an apology." Mark looked up, his expression confused at first. Johnny took a step closer, his presence undeniable, and Mark's confusion turned into a look of recognition. Johnny, still composed, added, "Everyone deserves respect, no matter their age or how fast they can pay for a cup of coffee. She's not a burden. She's a customer." Mark froze for a moment, his mind struggling to process what had just been said. Johnny Depp was standing right in front of him, calmly looking at him, waiting for a response. It took a few seconds for Mark to realize who the man was. At first, he thought it was just another regular customer, maybe a little more casual in his appearance. But as Johnny adjusted his sunglasses and smiled faintly, the recognition hit him. The actor, Johnny Depp, the man who had starred in some of the biggest movies of the past few decades. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had never expected someone like Johnny Depp to be sitting in his cafe, let alone standing up to defend one of his customers. The situation had suddenly taken a turn that Mark wasn't prepared for. He had been so caught up in his frustration with the elderly woman, so focused on his own stress, that he hadn't stopped to think about how his words had affected her. But now, standing face to face with Johnny Depp, he realized just how much of an impact his behavior had made. Johnny's calm presence was a stark contrast to Mark's growing sense of embarrassment. The other customers in the cafe had also started to notice the situation. Some of them had turned their heads, their eyes now fixed on Mark and Johnny, waiting to see how the cafe owner would react. Mark could feel the weight of the eyes on him, but it wasn't the attention he was used to. It wasn't the kind of attention that made him feel proud. It was the kind that made him feel small. And it was all because of his treatment of Mrs. Johnson. "I didn't mean to upset her," Mark said, his voice faltering a little. He wanted to explain himself, to justify his actions, but deep down, he knew there was no excuse. He had been rude, impatient, and unkind. And now, with Johnny standing in front of him, Mark couldn't hide from the truth. He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Johnny didn't interrupt him. He simply nodded, his expression still calm, but his eyes were filled with quiet disappointment. "It's not about intention, man," Johnny said softly. "It's about respect. We're all just trying to get through the day. But you never know what someone else is going through. You don't get to treat people like that, especially not someone who's just here for a little piece." Mark swallowed hard, feeling his face heat up with shame. He had been so focused on the pressures of running the cafe that he hadn't stopped to think about the people he was interacting with. Mrs. Johnson hadn't done anything wrong. She hadn't asked for anything special, just a simple cup of coffee. Yet he had treated her like a burden, like she was slowing him down. For a brief moment, Mark stood there, staring at Johnny, unable to find the words to respond. He had been caught in a mistake so simple, yet so deeply rooted in his own frustrations. Johnny, sensing the struggle, smiled gently, his voice more forgiving now. "You don't have to do anything big, just take a minute to think before you react. People deserve that." Mark nodded slowly, his mind racing. He knew he had a lot to make up for, starting with Mrs. Johnson. He turned toward the elderly woman, still sitting by the window, quietly finishing her coffee. He felt a pang of guilt, but he knew he had to make things right. "Ma'am, Mark began, his voice low. He took a deep breath before walking over to her table. Mrs. Johnson looked up as Mark approached, a hesitant smile on her face. She had noticed the interaction between Johnny and Mark, but she hadn't said anything. She had seen enough in her life to know when it was best to stay quiet, but now she wondered if Mark was coming to apologize. "I'm really sorry," Mark said, standing in front of her table. "I was out of line earlier. That wasn't how I should have treated you." His words were genuine, his voice filled with regret. He wasn't asking for her forgiveness. He just wanted her to know that he understood the mistake he had made. Mrs. Johnson's face softened as she looked up at him. She could tell he was sincere. She smiled gently, offering him a kind nod. "It's all right, dear. I'm just glad you understand." For Mark, that simple response felt like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. It wasn't going to fix everything, but it was a start. And sometimes, that's all you needed to begin making things right. As the tension in the cafe started to ease, the atmosphere shifted. The feeling of unease that had settled over the room began to dissipate, replaced by a new sense of calm. The customers who had been watching the interaction between Mark and Mrs. Johnson seemed to relax, their conversations picking up again. But Mark's mind was still racing. He couldn't believe how much he had let his frustration get the best of him. He was glad that Johnny had stepped in when he did. The actor's words had a weight to them, something that made Mark realize just how important respect was in every interaction. It wasn't just about serving coffee or making money. It was about treating people with kindness and understanding. And that was something he had clearly overlooked in his impatience. After a few moments of quiet reflection, Mark returned to the counter to check on the orders that were still waiting. He had apologized to Mrs. Johnson, and while it wasn't the easiest conversation, it was necessary. He was still a little embarrassed, but he felt a sense of responsibility to make sure things went better from here on out. Mrs. Johnson, meanwhile, had settled back into her chair by the window. She wasn't one to hold grudges. Life had taught her many lessons, and one of the most important was the power of forgiveness. She had lived long enough to know that people made mistakes. What mattered was whether they were willing to learn from them and grow. She glanced over at Johnny, who had returned to his seat, his notes in front of him once again. She was grateful for his kindness. It was rare to see someone stand up for what was right, especially in a moment that could have easily been brushed off. But Johnny had done what many others wouldn't. He had spoken out when it mattered. Johnny, for his part, was content to watch the scene unfold. He wasn't looking for praise or attention. He simply believed that people deserved to be treated well, especially in situations where kindness was in short supply. He knew that sometimes all it took was one person to speak up to change the course of an interaction, and that was exactly what he had done. As the minutes passed, the cafe started to return to its usual rhythm. Mark worked behind the counter with more focus, his movements less hurried now. He was still keeping an eye on the crowd, but something had shifted in him. He was more aware of the people around him, more conscious of how he interacted with them. The busy rush of the morning didn't seem as overwhelming as it had earlier. Mrs. Johnson, enjoying her coffee in peace, felt a sense of calm wash over her. The world outside the cafe was still moving fast, but she was content to be here, in this quiet moment, sipping her coffee and watching the world pass by. She had seen enough of life's ups and downs to know that kindness was a rare gift. It wasn't always easy to come by, but when it appeared, it made everything feel a little brighter. She smiled to herself, thinking about how the day had started with a little frustration, but had ended on a much better note. It was then that Mark, now with a calmer energy, approached her table once again. This time, his approach was different. He didn't seem rushed or irritated. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested in how she was doing. "Is everything okay with your coffee now?" he asked, his tone much gentler than before. Mrs. Johnson looked up at him, her smile returning. "Yes, thank you. It's perfect now." She could see the sincerity in his eyes, and she nodded, appreciating his effort to make things right. Mark smiled back, feeling a weight lifted off his shoulders. He didn't expect Mrs. Johnson to forget the earlier incident, but he knew he had done what he could to make up for it. As he walked away, he realized something important. It wasn't just about getting through the day or running a cafe. It was about the people who walked through his door, the people who trusted him to provide a little bit of warmth and comfort in their busy lives. And for the first time that morning, he truly understood the responsibility that came with it. The rest of the morning passed quietly, the chaos of the rush beginning to subside as the crowd thinned out. Mark continued to work behind the counter, his movements more thoughtful now. The earlier tension had faded, but it had left an impression on him. He found himself thinking about his actions more than usual, considering the way he treated people and the way his impatience had caused an unnecessary rift. He couldn't help but feel thankful that Johnny had been there to make him stop and reflect. It wasn't something he had planned, but it had changed his perspective. As the cafe grew quieter, Mark began to notice the little details around him that he hadn't paid much attention to before. The way people interacted with each other, the subtle expressions that told more than words ever could. He saw customers smile at each other across tables, exchanging small talk or laughs. He noticed how some people took the time to enjoy their coffee slowly, savoring each sip, while others rushed through it, their minds already on the next task ahead. Mark couldn't help but wonder how many moments like this he had missed in the past, how many interactions had slipped by unnoticed. It made him realize that in his hurry to keep everything moving, he had forgotten to take a step back and appreciate the simple things. He had been so focused on being efficient that he hadn't really been present. Meanwhile, Mrs. Johnson sat contentedly by the window, watching the people pass by outside. She didn't feel the need to rush through her coffee. She knew that each day was a gift, and sometimes the best thing you could do was take a moment to just be. She had been through many chapters of her life, and with each one, she had learned to find joy in the quiet moments, the ones that didn't ask for anything more than your attention. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice. "Excuse me, ma'am." She looked up to see Mark standing in front of her once again. This time, he didn't look rushed or impatient. There was a calmness to him, a gentleness that hadn't been there earlier. He smiled and spoke softly. "I just wanted to thank you again for being understanding this morning. I appreciate your patience." Mrs. Johnson smiled back at him, nodding slowly. "No need to thank me. I've learned that sometimes people just need a little time to realize things. It's not always easy, but it's important." Mark stood there for a moment, taking in her words. They weren't anything groundbreaking, but for him, they felt like a gentle reminder of what he had forgotten. Life wasn't just about moving quickly from one task to the next. It was about the connections we made along the way, the kindness we offered, and the way we treated others. "I'm glad you're still here," Mark said, his voice sincere. "I really do hope you enjoy the rest of your day." Mrs. Johnson chuckled softly. "I'm sure I will, and I'm glad to see you're in a better mood. You're doing a good job here. Just don't forget to be kind along the way." Mark smiled and nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude toward the elderly woman. Her words had hit home, more than he realized. After a few more minutes of quiet conversation, Mrs. Johnson finished her coffee and slowly gathered her things. She had been in no rush to leave, but she knew it was time. As she stood up, she gave Mark one last kind smile. "Take care, young man," she said, and with that, she walked out of the cafe, leaving behind a sense of calm in her wake. Mark watched her leave, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a little lighter. The cafe seemed different now, more than just a place where people came to grab a quick coffee. It was a space for connection, a place where people could slow down and appreciate the simple moments. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He would never forget the lesson that Mrs. Johnson had unknowingly taught him. It wasn't just about coffee or serving customers. It was about how we treat each other, how we show kindness, and how we choose to make the world a little better, one moment at a time. The day carried on peacefully after Mrs. Johnson left, but for Mark, things had changed. The cafe, which once felt like just a place for customers to come and go, now felt different. The small moments, the ones people often overlooked, had suddenly become more meaningful. Every customer who walked in was an opportunity to show kindness, an opportunity to make someone's day just a little bit better. As Mark worked, he found himself smiling more often, his movements less hurried. There was no rush anymore. It wasn't about how quickly he could get someone's order out. It was about giving them the time they needed, whether they were in a rush or not. He had learned that it wasn't just the coffee that mattered. It was the experience, the way people felt when they walked in and out of his cafe. Johnny Depp had left the cafe shortly after Mrs. Johnson did. He hadn't made a big show of it, slipping out quietly, just as he had come in. But Mark felt a sense of gratitude toward him too. Johnny hadn't done anything extraordinary. He had simply spoken up when it mattered. But sometimes that's all it took to make a difference. The afternoon brought more customers, some regulars, others new faces. Mark greeted each of them with a warm smile, asking how their day had been, taking a few extra seconds to listen to their answers. He felt like he was truly connecting with people in a way he never had before. And it felt good. The cafe had always been a busy place, but now there was a new sense of peace in the air. Customers sat at tables, chatting with friends or quietly reading their books, and no one seemed to mind the extra few minutes it took to get their coffee. People appreciated the small things, being asked how their day was, being treated like more than just another order to fill. As the day began to wind down, Mark reflected on the events that had unfolded. What started as a small disagreement had turned into something much more meaningful. He had learned the power of kindness, the importance of taking the time to be considerate, and it had come from a simple, unexpected moment. He had always thought he was doing his best, but now he realized there was always room for improvement. It wasn't about trying to please everyone. It was about making sure that every person who walked through his door felt respected and appreciated. Later that evening, as Mark closed up the cafe for the night, he found himself looking at the empty tables and thinking about the lessons he had learned. He had apologized to Mrs. Johnson, and she had accepted his apology with grace. It had been a small moment, but it had meant so much more than he could have ever imagined. The world could sometimes feel like a fast-moving, chaotic place, but Mark had learned that it was the quiet moments, the ones where you stopped to listen and care, that made the biggest difference. He smiled to himself, thinking that maybe the world didn't need to change all at once. Maybe it just needed people to slow down and be kind to each other. As he locked the door and turned off the lights, Mark felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known before. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he was ready for it. He knew now that the key to making life better wasn't about getting ahead or being the fastest. It was about showing up, being present, and treating others with the respect they deserved. And with that, Mark walked out into the night, his heart a little lighter, ready to face whatever the next day would bring.